In August of 2017, 26-year-old barista and amateur photographer Jessica Wild set out on a lonely hike along the Toxaway Trail, which ran through the wilds of central Idaho. She wrote to a friend that she came across a lake that looked like it was from another world and promised to return in a few days. But Jessica never came home. Her green Jeep was found locked at Pettit Lake, and there was no sign of her in the woods. 3 years passed before hunters came across a tree with the letter X carved into its bark. Under its roots lay the remains of Jessica Wild, and a new, darker story began than just a disappearance. On August 15, 2017, 26-year-old Jessica Wild left Boise before dawn. She was planning a 4-day hike along the Toxaway Trail, which winds through mountainsides and pine forests near the town of Stanley. Her co-workers at the coffee shop mentioned that she had been preparing for this trip for a long time, updating her equipment, checking her camera, studying the map. For her, such trips were not an escape, but a way to relieve tension, to find a shot that, as she said, would speak for itself. The last people to see Jess alive were the employees of the Stanley Energy gas station. The cashier recalled that she had stopped by in the afternoon, bought batteries, a few energy bars, and was smiling. She seemed calm and a little excited, like she was on an adventure, he said during the interrogation. The gas station had surveillance cameras, and police later confirmed that at 12:45, her green Jeep Cherokee drove off in the direction of Pettit Lake, where the trail began. On August 16th, according to her satellite messenger, she sent a short message to a friend. "The weather is perfect. I found a hidden lake. I'm going further tomorrow. If the connection is lost, don't worry." That was the last contact. When she didn't show up for her shift at the coffee shop on August 20th, her friend first thought Jess was just delayed on the road. But on the third day, when her phone remained turned off and her social media accounts were not updated, she contacted the police. The Camas County Sheriff's Department immediately notified the rescue service. The next morning, patrol officers found Jessica's car in a parking lot near the trail to Pettit Lake. The car was locked, with a camera with a spare lens, a first aid kit, and a bag of clothes inside. The keys were not found. The fuel in the tank was almost full, which indicated that she had left the car deliberately, with no intention of driving further. Near the door, a clear trace of her hiking boots remained in the ground, which was lost in the direction of the forest. The search operation began the same night. Volunteers, National Park Service employees, and a group of dogs joined in. A helicopter flew over the area several times, but the dense crowns of the spruce trees hid everything that was under them. For the first 2 days, the rescuers hiked nearly 30 miles of trails, checking all shelters and places to spend the night. There was not a single hint of Jessica's trail. On the third day of the search, one of the dogs picked up a scent near a small rocky pass. He led the team about a mile deep into the forest, where the trail dissolved among the granite fragments. There, the scent broke off. The report states that the ground is hard and crisscrossed with stone in this particular spot, so the smell could have simply disappeared. The rescuers found an abandoned fire, a cigarette butt, and a plastic wrapper from a candy bar of the same brand as the one Jessica bought at the gas station. However, the experts did not find any prints suitable for analysis on the wrapper. It could have been hers, or it could have been any of the hundreds of tourists. On August 23rd, the search was extended to an area of up to 50 miles around the lake. Thermal imagers were used, but by nightfall, the results were zero. The services called a break, hoping that the girl might have taken a different route and turned up on her own. However, a week passed with no sign of her. Jessica's family traveled from Boise. Her father, a former military officer, insisted that she should not be considered a victim of an accident. He said that his daughter had excellent terrain awareness, survival experience, and would have left some kind of sign, even if she had been injured or lost her way. Jess knew the rules, he repeated. She wouldn't just disappear. 10 days after the search began, a private investigator, a former police officer hired by Jess's colleagues, joined the investigation. He analyzed the GPS route from her messenger and identified the last coordinate, a section 3 miles off the main trail near an old riverbed. This sector was checked a second time, this time more thoroughly, with drones, metal detectors, and search dogs. Again, to no avail. By the end of August, the operation was scaled back. In an official statement, the sheriff said that the active phase was over, but the case was not closed. Posters with her photo were put up in the cities of Stanley, Salmon, and even Boise. In the first weeks of September, local journalists published a series of articles titled "The Mystery of the Toxaway Trail." One of them quoted a rescuer who noted a strange detail. "It seems to have dissolved. There is not a single trace, not even a sole print after that pass. It doesn't happen like that. Someone or something took her away from there." In the fall of 2017, the investigation was transferred to the Department of Missing Persons. Friends and volunteers returned to the forest from time to time, but all their attempts were in vain. With the first snow, the area around Lake Petit became inaccessible. Nature seemed to close the door behind her, leaving only a silent answer to the question of what happened to Jessica Wild. September 2017. Autumn came to the Stanley Valley quietly, without storms or lightning. The coniferous slopes, which had smelled of resin in the summer, were covered with a gray haze. For the locals, Jessica Wild's disappearance was a common topic of conversation in shops and coffee shops, but no longer news. The active search was stopped, and the case was officially filed as cold. In the sheriff's office, her file was placed on a shelf among others, with similar dates but different fates. Her friend, Melissa Gray, along with 2 colleagues from the coffee shop, couldn't accept that it ended with a report of probable death by accident. They raised money through a charity platform and hired a private investigator. His name was Ben Coltman, a former police officer with experience in searching for missing persons in mountainous areas. Coltman arrived in Stanley in late October. In his first interview, he told a local newspaper, "There is too much silence here. When there's too much of it, it's suspicious." The detective started with the obvious. He studied all the search materials, maps, interrogation protocols, and dog handler reports. Then he walked along the same path Jessica was supposed to be on. His route was recorded on CCTV cameras installed in the national park. At one point, where the forest parted to reveal a narrow valley, he noticed a subtle side path that was not on the official maps. After several hours of walking, Coltman came to a small lake, almost hidden among the mountain slopes. The water was dark, mirror-like, with a cold sheen that changed color depending on the sky. This was the place Jess had written about in her last message. Coltman checked archival descriptions from search groups and found that the lake had not been surveyed at the time. It was off the main route, and the dogs had lost the trail before this branch. The detective decided to return here later when he received more information. In the spring of 2018, he managed to find a tourist who had been in the area on the same days. His name was Aaron Davis, a resident of Oregon. He had gone to the police in the first weeks after Jess's disappearance, but his testimony was not included in the main report because it was considered secondary. During a second conversation with Coltman, Davis told more details. According to him, on August 16th, around noon, he went out to a small lake south of the main trail. There he saw a girl taking pictures of the shore and standing knee-deep in water. "She looked happy," he said, "didn't even notice me." Davis didn't dare approach her, but as he climbed higher up the slope, he looked back and saw someone else standing nearby. A man of average height, wearing a camouflage jacket and carrying a large backpack. He did not move and seemed to be just watching. The witness remembered this detail only because the man's presence seemed too calm to him. Later, when he heard about Jessica's disappearance, he thought that it might have been her he saw that day, but decided that he was not sure enough to go to the police. Only now, during a second interview, did he describe what he saw in detail. Coltman checked all the official tourist registrations for that weekend. According to park rules, everyone who goes on a multi-day hike must leave a note in the Ranger Service's logbook. However, no one matching the description was on the list. Several names came up, including a hunter from Utah who had hiked another section of the Toxawi and a photographer from Seattle, but none of them matched the description. The detective went to local gear stores to find out who might have been buying camouflage clothing or camping knives in those days. The sellers mentioned many people, but no one recognized the man described. One of the shop owners even jokingly said, "Half the town here wears camouflage, especially in the fall." When Coltman checked the register of hunting permits, it turned out that several local farmers did indeed have the right to shoot in the area. However, their routes did not pass near that lake. There were no official suspects. In his notes, the detective wrote, "The man in camouflage is the only thread that keeps the story alive. If he was a local, he knew these places better than any tourist, and he was the last to see her." By the summer of 2018, the trail had gone cold again. No new clues appeared, and the map on which the detective marked all the search points resembled a chaotic network, lots of lines. No conclusion. When Coltman returned to the lake for the last time, the grass was already above his knees, and only fragments of branches reminded him that a person had once been searched for there. Locals avoided talking about the story. Some said that Jess could have fallen into one of the deep crevasses that appear after the snow melts. Others assumed that an animal had taken her, but those who knew her closely did not believe in accidents. They all felt that something had happened in the forest, and someone knew more about it than they were saying. Coltman left the town at the end of August, but he sent his report to the sheriff's office. It was written in black and white. Suspect unidentified. The whereabouts of the missing person are unknown. It is recommended to resume the search in case of new evidence. It seemed that the story of Jessica Wild was frozen between two worlds, the official silence of the archives and the invisible truth that the forest hid under its thick carpet. August of 2020 was hot, even for Idaho. The forests around Alta Lake were suffocatingly quiet, the air thick, as if nature itself did not want anyone to disturb its silence. There, southeast of the lake, was a group of hunters, 4 men from the town of Haley, who hunted deer every year in the same area. They knew these places to the smallest detail, every stone, every ravine, every trail the animals usually took. That morning, they set off earlier than usual. The sun was just touching the tops of the spruce trees when they started to descend into a narrow valley where, according to the older man, deer often came to drink water. Around noon, 2 hunters got separated from the main group. Their names were Douglas Mitchell and Roy Barton. They were moving along the bed of a dried-up stream when Roy noticed something unusual, a fallen fir tree that had formed a kind of tunnel with roots under it. A strange mark was darkening on its trunk. He called his partner, and when they got closer, they saw a large, rough letter X carved into the bark. The carving was old, the edges had darkened with time, but the shape was still intact. At first, the men thought it was a hunting mark or a sign of the old rangers who used to mark areas for inspection. But when they bent down to take a closer look, they saw something pale under the roots. At first, Douglas thought it was an animal bone, but when he broke open the dry leaves, he realized it was a human skull. Around it were the remains of decomposed clothes, a jacket, pants, and torn shoes. Everything looked as if the body had been there for at least several years. Both men stepped back without touching anything and immediately called the Blaine County Sheriff's Office. Rangers, a medical examiner, and 2 detectives arrived at the scene. The area was surrounded by yellow tape, and the hunters were questioned on the spot. One of them later told reporters, "At first we thought we had stumbled upon an old grave, but when we saw the camera near the body, everything became clear. Someone died here for a reason." Under the fir tree, in the shadow of the roots, there was a torn tourist backpack. Inside were a lens, a roll of cord, a notebook, and an energy bar wrapper. A camera was lying next to it, half covered with earth. The body was damaged, the lens was broken, but the memory card was intact. They worked carefully at the scene. Each item was labeled and packed separately. The body was partially skeletonized. On the remains of the clothes, experts found traces of moisture and moss, a sign that the person had died here long ago, even before the tree fell. A silver bracelet with a small crescent-shaped pendant was preserved on the hand. It would later become the main clue for identification. After a preliminary examination, the expert determined that the body belonged to a woman of approximately average height. Her age at the time of death was between 20 and 30 years old. These data matched the profile of Jessica Wild, who disappeared 3 years ago in a neighboring neighborhood. The next day, a special team from Boise arrived at the scene. They examined the surrounding area within a radius of several hundred yards. No other remains or personal belongings were found. Investigators speculated that the body could have been moved or accidentally trapped under a fallen tree after a storm that hit the area in the summer of 2018. But the X mark over the body was disturbing. It looked too deliberate, as if someone wanted to mark a place. The laboratory at the forensic center compared the dental records. A few days later, they received confirmation that the remains belonged to Jessica Wild. The match was complete. The police officially notified her family and made a brief statement to the press. The person has been identified. The death does not appear to be an accident. From that moment on, the case ceased to be a disappearance and became a murder investigation. When the experts examined the camera in more detail, they managed to remove the memory card. It contained several dozen pictures taken on the day of the disappearance. Landscapes, water, stones, sun glare on the surface of the lake. But one of the shots, taken apparently by accident, struck everyone who saw it for the first time. In the distance, between the trunks, stood the dark figure of a man in a camouflage jacket. At that moment, it was not yet evidence, just a shadow on the screen. But it was the one that brought all the old versions back to life. Jessica did not get lost, did not fall into a gorge, did not have an accident. She met someone in the woods. The medical examiner recorded several details that would later become key. The bones of the neck had microcracks which could indicate strong pressure, possibly strangulation. However, due to the long time the body had been lying in the open air, it was difficult to establish the final cause of death. When information about the discovery leaked to the press, journalists gathered outside the Stanley police station. Some brought old photos of Jess, others quoted posts from her blog. For many, it was the end of a long wait, but for the detectives, it was only the beginning. Because next to her remains was not just a camera. Next to her was a question that no one had yet answered: who carved the sign on the tree and why exactly above her body? After the official identification of the deceased, the case of Jessica Wild was transferred to the Idaho State Police Major Crimes Unit. Detective Nate Caldwell, an experienced investigator who had worked on similar cases of missing tourists in mountainous areas, was appointed as the new leader. He arrived in Stanley a day after the results of the forensic examination were announced. His arrival marked the beginning of a new phase. This was no longer an accidental death investigation, but a murder. Caldwell began with the physical evidence recovered from the scene. The camera, backpack, bracelet, and fabric fragments were re-examined. The main focus was on the memory card from the camera. Technicians from a laboratory in Boise were able to recover most of the pictures taken on the day of the disappearance. The pictures show landscapes familiar to the locals: mountains, pine trees, clouds reflected in the lake. But among the dozens of ordinary photographs, there were a few last ones that left investigators breathless. In one of the pictures, taken at an acute angle, a man in a camouflage jacket was accidentally caught in the frame. He stood at a distance, a few dozen yards from Jessica, a little further away between the trunks. The figure was blurred, but the silhouette was clear. A wide backpack, shoulders slumped, head slightly tilted. It is impossible to see the face. The camera focused on the foreground, and the background remained blurred. Image restoration experts confirmed that this was not an accidental spot or glare. The person was indeed standing and watching. Then there were photos of water, rocks, and clouds, as if she continued shooting without noticing the presence of an intruder. Then the camera went silent forever. It was this chain of shots, from idyllic landscapes to the appearance of a shadow behind, that became the centerpiece of the new version of events. Forensic experts carefully examined the tree under which the body was found. They found that the letter X on the bark had been carved by a sharp instrument, such as a tactical knife or hunting blade. The wood tissue under the bark layer showed that the mark was made at least 2 or 3 years before the trunk fell. This meant that the mark appeared around the same time as Jessica's disappearance. Park Service experts confirmed that such symbols are not used by rangers or hunters. For service marks, they use paint or markings on ribbons, but never cut the bark. The character of the blade, according to the expert, showed the confidence of the hand. Not an accidental scratch, but a precise movement made by a person who was used to working with a knife. Additional examination of soil samples near the tree roots revealed polyester microparticles that could have come from backpack straps or synthetic clothing. Their composition matched the materials used to make Jessica's gear. This indicated that she had been lying there since her death and had not been moved later. The forensic expert who reanalyzed the bones recorded a number of characteristic injuries to the cervical spine. 3 vertebrae had microcracks caused by severe compression. Such injuries are not consistent with a fall or pressure from the ground. They could have been caused by a noose or a strong hand squeezing the neck. Despite the decomposition, the remains of dark-colored fibers were found on the clothes, probably fragments of rope or cord. The expert was unable to give an exact cause of death, but indicated that asphyxiation or strangulation was the most likely cause. Detective Caldwell's report stated that the evidence found was indicative of intentional violence. No animal marks that could have damaged the body were found. Valuable items, a camera, jewelry, even a wallet, were not missing, so the robbery version was rejected. The police began checking all cases of strangers in the Alta Lake area in the summer of 2017. A ranger's report stated that in August, several tourists reported a strange man walking around the campsites and not answering when approached. His description matched that given by witness Aaron Davis 3 years ago, middle-aged, wearing a camouflage jacket, carrying an old-style backpack. Caldwell ordered a psychological profile of the possible perpetrator. An FBI consultant invited to the case noted in a preliminary report that a person who leaves an X mark may perceive it as a signature or a symbol of control over the crime scene. Similar cases are known in criminal practice. Serial human hunters often mark the territory of their actions, like hunters mark traps. For the locals, the appearance of detectives and cars with crime scene signs came as a shock. They could not believe that someone could live for years near a murder scene without knowing about it. In shops and coffee shops, people started talking about Jessica again. Some people recalled seeing a lone man buying gas cylinders and dry rations in those years. Others swore that he appeared in the city only occasionally, like a shadow. All these testimonies were collected in a separate report, but there was no concrete evidence. Caldwell called it a vicious circle, the same descriptions, the same suspicions, but no names. In an internal report, he drew a cautious conclusion. The killer was probably a local or someone who knew this part of the national forest well. He chose a place that was not marked on any tourist map and left a sign that was meaningful only to him. Whether it meant a goal, victory, or warning remained a mystery. The investigation was officially ongoing, but even police reports were beginning to use the words unknown assailant. It seemed that the forest had once again cast a shadow, hiding the face of the one who had carved his predatory mark on the trunk 3 years earlier. After several weeks of analyzing evidence, the Jessica Wild case went beyond the county. Federal agents joined the investigation, including an FBI profiler from the Behavioral Analysis Unit. His name was Mark Grayson, a former military psychologist who specialized in crimes in remote areas. He arrived in Boise in late September, bringing with him stacks of old reports, maps of national parks, and a thick folder of cases of missing persons in the Rocky Mountains. The first thing Grayson did was look at the photographs of the site. The fallen tree, the shadow of the roots, the X on the trunk. He looked at the picture for a long time and, according to one of the detectives, said only, "This is no accident, it's a ritual." His comment was included in the first section of the psychological profile. According to the joint conclusions of the investigators, the killer was most likely a local resident or a person who knew the forest very well. He navigated the area without a map, understood where the ranger patrols ended, and knew all the invisible paths that could be used to get around unnoticed. The place where the body was found is not just random. It is an area that is almost impossible to reach without accurate knowledge of the terrain. That's why the profiler concluded that the offender operates within his own environment, perhaps considering these forests his own territory. The second trait is a habit of loneliness. This type does not seek company, but keeps a close eye on others. Probably he is a hunter or fisherman, has a hunting permit, which allows him to be in the forest without suspicion. The camouflage seen in the photo only supports this hypothesis. During the search, investigators checked all active hunting licenses in Blaine County and neighboring counties. They found hundreds of them. Most of the owners are farmers or seasonal workers living along the Snake River. However, none of them came under direct suspicion. The third characteristic is organization. The person who leaves the X mark thinks systematically. They don't just bury a body, they create a sign, a symbol that is meaningful only to them. In his report, Grayson called this a signature of territorial control. Such criminals do not act on impulse. They plan, they observe, they choose their moment. The very fact that Jessica's belongings were not taken showed that the motive was not material. The motive is probably psychological, a desire for power, or the need for punishment. In his report, Grayson noted, "We are dealing with a man who considers himself the guardian of this land. For him, tourists are a threat, strangers who desecrate his territory. Such a criminal is convinced that he is doing justice by eliminating those who disturb the order in his mind." Detective Caldwell decided to check if there had been any similar cases in previous years, disappearances or deaths of tourists under similar circumstances. The archival reports showed a strange pattern. Every few years, single travelers, mostly young people traveling unaccompanied, disappeared in the same county. Most of the cases remained unsolved. To collect more data, the police launched a large-scale operation. All outfitters, hunting clubs, and fishing shops within a 50-mile radius received requests for information about suspicious customers. They were looking for people who bought tactical knives with blades longer than 6 inches, which is the kind of tool experts believe could have been used to carve the letter into the wood. The shop owners were eager to cooperate. One of them, a resident of Salmon, reported a man who had been buying knives and ropes regularly several years ago, but always paid in cash and left no contact information. His description matched the profile: middle-aged, bearded, strong build, and silent. However, without a name, this trail quickly melted away. At the same time, detectives interviewed all the rangers and hunters who patrolled the area in the summer of 2017. One of them, a veteran of the service named Harry Lawson, said that he had several times come across abandoned camps where someone had left strange objects, pieces of cloth, burnt candles, even old hunting marks. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now he remembered that he had also seen scratches on trees nearby that looked like the same X sign. Caldwell ordered a map to be drawn of all the places where such marks might have been. When the data was collected, a scattering of dots appeared on the screen, most of them within 30 miles of Stanley. It looked like a limited area where the offender felt confident. For the profiler, this was confirmation that he was not a traveler, but a settled resident, possibly a logging worker or a hunting warden. The investigation took on the character of a continuous search of the environment. Detectives visited farms, fishing huts, even old parking lots that had long been abandoned. They talked to locals, asking the same questions, whether anyone had seen the hermit in camouflage, who often disappears into the woods. Several witnesses confirmed that such a man did exist. He was seen at a gas station near Stanley, buying gasoline in cans and acting aloof, as if he didn't want to be remembered. When investigators reviewed surveillance footage from recent years, they found a blurry image. A man in a hunting jacket walking with a can to an old pickup truck with no license plate. The photo was too blurry to identify the individual, but a clothing match again confirmed one line of inquiry: a man in camouflage familiar with every ravine in these woods. The FBI formulated a final profile: a loner, hunter, or fisherman, aged 30 to 50, physically strong, with experience in surviving in the wilderness. Probably has problems with social adaptation, may have experienced trauma or loss, and then chose isolation. For him, murder is not a crime, but a way to maintain his internal order. While the analysts were compiling this portrait, Detective Caldwell realized that the forest was silent for a reason. Each of its signs, each old mark, could be part of a larger map left by the killer. And somewhere among these trees, there is still a tree with a carved letter whose meaning has not yet been read. The beginning of 2019 brought silence to the investigation. After high-profile publications and press statements, the Jessica Wild case gradually lost momentum. Detective Caldwell continued to work, but each new trail crumbled as soon as it was touched. No fingerprints, no DNA, no person to question twice. The forest was silent again, just like the day she disappeared. Then Caldwell decided to do something different. He went back to the archives, to the old cabinets of the Missing Persons Unit, where dozens of unsolved cases were covered in dust. His goal was to find a pattern, any detail that could explain the appearance of the X. For several weeks, he pored over reports of missing hikers within a 50-mile radius of Stanley over the past 2 decades. In March, the detective came across a case from 2012. A 35-year-old hiker named Eric Doyle had gone missing. His car was found near the Clark Point Trail, and a search party discovered an old tree with an X nearby. At the time, this was not given any importance. The rescuers decided that it was a mark of hunters or loggers. Doyle's body was never found, and the case was filed away. Caldwell contacted a forensic laboratory in Boise and asked them to compare photos of that tree with the tree Jessica was found under. The analysis showed a surprising resemblance. The cut pattern, depth, even the handwriting of the hand were almost identical. The expert's report included the phrase, "The marks could have been made by the same person using a similar type of tool." This was the first real breakthrough in several years. Next, the detectives mapped all the places where similar carvings had ever been found, or where travelers had disappeared. The result was a ring with a radius of about 30 miles from Stanley. At least 5 disappearances have been recorded in this area over the course of 2 decades that have never been solved, all within this same zone. Caldwell called it a silent circle. The search for those who might have known the area so well has narrowed the detectives down to a narrow list. Among them were hunters, fishermen, loggers, and Park Service workers. All of them passed the screening. It was then that the FBI analyst drew attention to an old administrative violation report. In the summer of 2016, a man named Matthew Graves was fined for parking improperly at the entrance to the White Valley Trail. Under normal circumstances, this would not have mattered, but this trail ran just a few miles from where Eric Doyle disappeared. Graves' file was short but telling. The 41-year-old Idaho native, a logging worker, lived alone in a wooden house on a hillside outside the town of Stanley. The police had 2 old convictions on his record for illegal hunting and resisting arrest. His former employer described him as a reserved person, not prone to talk. Almost no one in the city knew him. He rarely went out into the center, bought groceries in bulk, and carried gasoline in cans. Having received a search warrant, the police went to his house on the morning of June 19th. The road led through a wooded area overgrown with weeds and a sign that said, "Private Property." Graves met them calmly, without resistance. According to eyewitnesses, he merely said that he was doing nothing wrong. The house was simple: old furniture, the smell of oil and wood, and a stove in the corner. But the most interesting thing was his workshop, located in a separate shed behind the house. There was a wooden table, shelves with tools, and a wall almost completely covered with photographs. At first glance, they were landscapes, trees, streams, and mountain ranges. But upon closer inspection, it became clear that many of the pictures depicted people, tourists walking along the trails, standing near tents, sitting by the fire. All the shots were taken from a distance, from such an angle that only the figures in the lens were visible. The people in the pictures did not know that they were being watched. The police seized several rolls of film, an old camera, and a hard drive, but there was not a single photo of Jessica Wild among them. According to the experts, all the shots were taken in different years, mostly in the summer season. The conclusion was clear: Graves was systematically watching tourists. When asked about the photos, he answered calmly. He said that he was engaged in wild photography and that these people were accidentally caught in the frame. According to one of the detectives, his voice remained flat, almost emotionless. He showed his hunting permit and work documents, which stated that he had been working at a logging site nearby for the past 5 years. During the search, forensic experts looked for traces of blood, tissue fibers, and any items that might belong to the victims. However, the analysis revealed nothing. Everything was clean, too clean for a workspace. Caldwell wrote in his report, "The place looks sterile. Either he is truly innocent or he cleaned too thoroughly." After 12 hours of inspection, the warrant expired. Graves was returned some of his belongings and remained free. But for investigators, he became the main suspect. A red note was added to his file: "Surveillance to continue." That evening, Caldwell sat in his office with a map laid out on the table. On it, black markers marked the places of disappearances and the X's found. If you drew the lines, all the points converged on the same neighborhood, the one where Matthew Graves lived. Although there was no evidence yet, the detective's intuition told him that this map told a story written by only one author. A few days after the search of Matthew Graves's house, information about it leaked to the press. Local journalists quoted police as saying that a man is being investigated in Stanley County for taking pictures of tourists in the woods without their knowledge. The name was not mentioned, but in a small town, it is impossible to hide details. People quickly realized who it was. Gossip spread through bars, shops, and gas stations. Graves had been seen as a recluse, but now he was the subject of real concern. It was after this publication that a new witness showed up at the police station. It was Graves' former logging colleague, a man named Derek Holland. He came alone, without a summons, and, according to the officer on duty, looked tired but determined. He began his testimony with the words, "I should have done this a long time ago." Holland worked with Graves in the summer of 2016 on a plot of land bordering a national park. There they cut down old trees for a private company that had permission to clear the forest. The work lasted for weeks. Sometimes they spent the night in trucks or in temporary trailers. At that time, he says, Graves was already acting strangely, reluctant to talk, not drinking alcohol, but often disappearing after his shift as if he had his own business in the forest. One morning in late August, they were both working near the Toxawi Trail. The sun was already high when Graves suddenly stopped, picked up his binoculars, and looked through the trees for a long time. Then he called out to Holland. When he came over, Graves pointed to a small clearing. There, a few hundred yards away, was a young woman in hiking gear. She was taking pictures of the creek bank and did not seem to notice that she was being watched. "Look," Graves said, "another naive hen wandering into my woods. They don't even know they're being watched." Holland memorized this phrase verbatim. He was alarmed by the tone, not joking, but calm, almost detached. When he asked if Graves knew the woman, he just smiled and said he was going to check the traps. According to the witness's recollection, Graves took a small black backpack from the truck, which he called his emergency kit. It always contained a flashlight, a knife, a rope, a water flask, and a pack of cigarettes. That day, he walked toward the trail, leaving Holland alone at work. He returned only in the evening. His hands were scratched, his clothes were dirty, and his face was covered in silence. He didn't say a word, just threw his backpack in the back of the truck and drove off to the trailer. Holland didn't think much of it, though he felt anxious. That summer, Graves disappeared several times after his shift, explaining that he was checking traps or looking for places to cut new timber. But after the incident, he became more withdrawn, hardly speaking to his coworkers. A few weeks later, the season ended, and the team left. They haven't seen each other since. When Holland read in the newspaper about a man filming tourists in the woods, he saw the scene before his eyes: a woman in a clearing, a camouflaged figure with binoculars, and the phrase, "my woods." He went to the police, realizing that this could be important evidence. During the interrogation, he repeated several times that he was afraid of the consequences, but wanted to do the right thing. The investigators listened to him carefully. He described the backpack, dark, worn, with a crescent-shaped patch. There were always a few items inside that Graves did not allow anyone to touch. According to the witness, the backpack contained a small metal container and an old phone without a SIM card. These details amazed the detectives because they had not found anything like this during the previous search. Caldwell wrote down every word and passed the testimony to the district attorney. Technically, this was not enough to make an arrest, but it was enough to get a new search warrant. The document stated that the police were looking for an item that could be a customized storage container for trophy items. FBI psychologists have confirmed that this behavior is typical of criminals with an obsessive need for control. They keep their victims' belongings as a symbol of victory. If the backpack really exists, it could contain the most valuable thing. The personal trinkets of those Graves was stalking. Meanwhile, the city started talking about the forest and its secrets again. In the bars, people whispered that the police know almost everything but can't prove it. Some people said they had seen Graves in recent days. He had become more withdrawn, not leaving his house, as if he was waiting. For Caldwell, this was a signal to act quickly. He knew that Holland's testimony not only opened a new page, but also confirmed a long-held suspicion. The man in camouflage was not a casual traveler, but an observer who had turned the forest into his own arena. And somewhere among his belongings, there was still a backpack that could tell everything that the earth had not yet told. A warrant for a second search of Matthew Graves' studio was served on the Stanley Police in September of 2020. This time, the document was more detailed. The court authorized the inspection of not only the workshop, but also the basement, attic, and vehicles of the suspect. The basis was the testimony of a former colleague who described an emergency backpack and the items that could be stored in it. It was a cold morning when Detective Caldwell and the forensic team arrived. Graves met them in silence. He allowed them to enter, as if he realized that resistance would not change anything. The investigators proceeded slowly, recording every detail. They lifted the floor of the workshop, checked the panels on the walls, and turned out boxes of tools. For almost 3 hours, they found nothing. Only when the technician came across a cavity between the boards near the back wall did everything change. Under a layer of sawdust and old rags was a small metal chest, closed with 2 screws. When it was opened, inside was a dark backpack with frayed fabric, the same one described by the witness. The backpack contained dozens of small items: keys with various keychains, a folding flashlight, silver bracelets, a metal lighter, a piece of engraved glass, and several old camera memory cards. Each item was wrapped separately in plastic, like an exhibit. At the bottom was a small notebook with a dark green cover. When it was opened, the first pages showed a familiar handwriting: short notes, sketches of leaves, sketches of stones and wood. It was Jessica Wild's notebook, which was not found among her belongings after her disappearance. For Caldwell, this was the moment when all the pieces of history came together. The notebook became indisputable evidence, an object that linked Graves directly to the crime scene. The forensic team carefully removed the rest of the contents. Among the items was an old smartphone without a SIM card, with a cracked screen. It was sent for examination to a laboratory in Boise. Within a few days, technicians recovered files from the internal memory. They found dozens of photos and several short videos shot with a hidden camera. The pictures showed forest trails, clearings, tents, and people who did not realize they were being watched. Men, women, sometimes even teenagers. Some shots were taken from a distance, through an optical sight. Others are from such a distance that every movement and gesture is visible. In one of the videos, the camera is shaky, and Graves's voice is heard behind the frame. He describes what he sees in a calm, measured tone. They don't feel the forest. They come, they break, they leave garbage. I do what I have to do. These places need to be cleaned up. Another video shows the letter X carved into the trunk, the same sign that was found over Jessica's body. A few seconds later, its shadow appears in the frame. The voice continues, "The X is my autograph. Someday they will realize that I left the map. Someone has to remind the world that the forest is unforgiving." These words became key. On the recording, Graves could be heard moving around, breathing in heavily but steadily. Experts established the date of creation of the files, August 2017, the exact time when Jessica Wild disappeared. When the detectives presented him with the found materials, he did not try to deny it. According to the witnesses, Graves sat quietly, just twiddling his thumbs. Then he said that he did nothing wrong, just regained his balance. His interrogation lasted several hours. He spoke without emotion, as if describing his work. He admitted to killing several people, but emphasized that he considered his actions to be clearing the forest of outsiders. For him, it was a philosophy, a kind of war for the territory he considered sacred. Psychologists present at the interrogation later described him as a person with a complete lack of compassion. He did not use the words victims or people, only they. He said that he put the marks on the trees for myself to remember the places where the balance was restored. After the confession, police conducted additional searches around his workshop and along the trails he frequented. No new bodies were found, but fragments of burnt fabric, the remains of old clothes, were found in the soil near the house. Experts did not rule out that these were the remains of his previous trophies that he tried to destroy. The trial of Matthew Graves lasted several months. The prosecution was based on evidence from the backpack, the results of the smartphone examination, and confessions during interrogation. The defense tried to prove his mental imbalance, but forensic psychiatrists concluded that he was aware of his actions. He was found sane. The verdict was expected: life imprisonment without the possibility of early release. During the hearing, he did not say a word, just looked in front of him. When the judge announced the verdict, the room was deafeningly silent. For the police, it was the end of a long investigation, but for the families of the disappeared, it was only the beginning of the pain. They were returned some of the items found in the backpack. Among them was Jessica's notebook, now a piece of evidence and a memory at the same time. After the verdict, journalists wrote that the forest around Stanley had become a place where silence no longer seemed peaceful. Matthew Graves spent years among these trees, turning them into his refuge and his trap. Jessica Wild's story reminded us that even the most beautiful places can hide someone who listens in silence and waits.